Up, everybody? Hopefully you have enjoyed the World War I unit. I know I've heard a lot of positive comments about that, and many people thought that World War I was kind of picking up the pace of history from where we started the year. I think a lot of the stuff that we have coming up is kind of closer to the World War I than maybe some of the drier things from the beginning of the year. So anyway, hopefully everybody liked this unit, and here we are wrapping it up. So this will be the last chunk of notes I'm giving you for World War I. It's going to kind of tie up the loose ends and kind of where we left off with the Lost Battalion last week and America joining in the war. Remember, America only joins in really for like the last year of the war, and we kind of tipped the tide in favor of the Allies. So this note slide is going to give you a lot of the results. As of right now, I don't think I'm going to tie this into a quiz, but maybe I will at some point. So I would definitely encourage you to put this in your notes. And I'll tell you 100% for sure, there's about probably 4 or 5 exam questions that'll come off of this slide of notes. So even if we don't use it here in the next week or so for a class quiz or assignment, you will be using it for the exam. So no big rush on getting through these notes, but you definitely want to get this stuff added in. As we're moving on from World War I, and it will come back for this semester exam. So conclusion for World War I. First up, kind of like once the Allies win the war and Germany signs an armistice, it means they like a ceasefire where they never really like get invaded and conquered. This isn't like the end of World War II where we are like marching in the streets of German cities and we have a complete and full like total victory. For World War I, it was kind of like the German army had just gotten so exhausted and so overextended that they just kind of broke. And the German leadership basically throws their hands up and says, we're done fighting. But the Allies don't actually march into Germany, but then they start to negotiate a peace treaty. So like, what's going to come of all this? Well, I do want you to write in and account for the 14 points. Now, you don't need to know all 14 of the points. You actually don't need to know any of the points. But what I do want you to have is that the 14 points was like America's plan for peace. Know specifically that President Wilson, who we're going to talk about quite a bit more coming up, and he usually goes down as one of like the most influential American presidents. This was kind of his brainchild. This was something that he came up with. And it actually, Wilson, who ends up becoming a very powerful president, and he makes the presidency in general a much more powerful position. And a lot of people say like the executive branch became the most dominant branch of government kind of over Congress or the courts in his presidency. He kind of started us on that trajectory. He is a very smart guy. He had been a college professor, had been governor of New Jersey. Now he's the president. We had talked about him a little bit prior to all this. So his plan for peace is the 14 points. And to give you a few like examples of kind of sort of what he's talking about, now all of the points are like paragraphs long. This would be a pretty big document to read. But to give it to you in a nutshell, like point 1 was about no more alliances. The alliances, like everybody being in alliance with everybody else, all it took was one fight to break out. It was Austria and Serbia, and then it triggered the whole alliance system, and everybody gets involved in this massive war. So he was saying no more secret alliances. Let's get rid of all that. Let's not be on teams anymore. Freedom of the seas, where Germany had been blockaded, and then Germany uses U-boats to go sink British merchant ships. He said, like, everybody can use the oceans. It's basically like public territory. Freedom of trade. Nobody can interfere with anybody else. That's point 3. Everybody can trade with everybody. You can't block that down or blockade anybody. Point 4 was like reduce the size of armies and militaries. It's a pretty common sense plan, but a key thing for you, it gets rejected. The other countries that had fought much longer, they're not really interested in a very, like lofty philosophical plan that would kind of make the world a better place. They fought in this war much longer than America, and I'm talking about like the British and French, and they want to punish Germany for how this war turned out and for losing millions of young men. So 14 points, that's Wilson's plan for peace. It was kind of America's plan, but it doesn't get adopted in. It's rejected by the other Allied powers. Next up, there is a peace conference in Paris. Paris is the capital city of France. That's what the Germans had been trying to capture. They never quite get to it. but that was the city that was chosen for all the Allied powers and the German representatives to come to. And they sit down actually in a big palace outside of Paris that the French kings used to live in. And that's where they start negotiating this. Now, a key point I want you to have here at the Paris Peace Conference. Remember, America gets in and fights in the war for about a year. We really only had a lot of guys in the trenches for about the last 6 months of the war. America comes out looking pretty good. We took the lightest losses of any of the major powers. So we're less bitter about the war. Wilson wants to kind of have like a forgive and forget. Like, let's move forward. Let's make the world a better place and not be bitter and like vindictive about how this war had all like played out. The British and French, and you can kind of see if you put yourself in their shoes, they have a very different perspective. They had been fighting for years and years and years and had lost like millions of young men. Their economies are in ruins. Their empires are kind of in tatters and falling apart. They're very, very bitter about this, and they have a different mindset. They both agree that they want to punish Germany and really kick Germany's butt because, of course, like if Germany had won, they would blame the Allied powers for the war. Well, the Germans lost, so the Allied powers are blaming Germany for the war. So it kind of makes sense there. All right, the League of Nations is formed. Now, you may have heard of the United Nations that's around today and headquartered in New York City. Well, I would just want you to know, this is something that could be on the test too. You're not going to have to explain it or give a lot of detail about it, but the League of Nations was kind of like a prototype for what the United Nations is today. It was a first run at it. President Wilson, it was his idea. So the American president says, let's have this like international peacekeeping organization that all the big countries of the world get together, send their representatives in, and they can talk out their problems. And he thought that, hey, if we had something like this prior to World War I breaking out, maybe the war wouldn't have happened. Maybe we could have got together and worked out these issues rather than the alliance system getting triggered and this whole massive war just kind of consuming Europe and much of the rest of the world. Ironically, this plan, the 14 points, does not get adopted. It doesn't get used. The League of Nations does, but the one really weird kind of ironic twist to it is, even though it was our idea, our president said, like, let's do this, let's create a League of Nations, America was the one big country that doesn't join. And why is that? Well, it was because you had a situation kind of like what we have today, where the president was a Democrat, but the Senate was controlled by Republicans. Exactly how it's going to be after this election cycle. At least it appears that way. So the Senate, because there are different parties and they bicker back and forth, the Republican Senate said, we don't want to get involved in this. And they didn't want Wilson to like look good and come out like the golden boy. So they reject the idea of getting into the League of Nations, and how they justified it. They said, you know what, if we get involved in this and get in there, then we're going to get sucked into more wars, that America is going to be like the enforcement arm of it. And we don't want it. We don't really care about these European conflicts or conflicts taking in place all over the world. That let's go back to just kind of minding our own business and taking care of Americans first. So anyway, League of Nations gets rejected by America, but it does get created. We'll come back to that later when we're building up to World War II. All the big countries in Europe do join up in it. All right, next up. Here's a political cartoon for you. I'm kind of blocking it, but here is a big snake, and I don't know if you can see it on there, but it says international strife. And then here, the little rabbit, the bunny there, is the League of Nations. And it's kind of like the message is that the League of Nations is doomed from the beginning. That the League of Nations has good intentions. It's a sweet, soft little bunny like that, but just like the conflict, the differences between all these big countries around the world are inevitably going to lead to more conflict down the road, and that the poor little League of Nations is going to get gobbled up by that snake. Here is a photo of the League of Nations when they were meeting in Switzerland, which Switzerland is a notoriously neutral country. In both world wars, Switzerland is like the one place in Europe that stays out of both wars, and they're neutral through all of it. So it was a good meeting place for it because the Swiss have always been neutral. They don't really pick a side. They stay out of fights. Everybody can feel safe there in Switzerland. Anyway, this is like when Hitler comes to power. We'll talk more about that down the road. But when the League of Nations starts to kind of unravel and come apart, it works okay for a while, but eventually the international strife does become, just too intense, and the peace doesn't. It lasts for about a 20-year period, but then, of course, we're going to get into World War II in the not too distant future in this class, and the whole conflict ignites again. All right, next up. Now, this one has a lot of writing on it, but there's some important things here. Let me move my mug here. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles is how you pronounce that. Everybody says Versailles, but that's not how, it's a French word, Versailles. That's the big palace outside of Paris. It's an amazing place. I actually got to visit it when I was out of college, but this beautiful, just immaculate palace that the French kings used to live in. So anyway, think of it as kind of like the Treaty of Paris, because Versailles is just a big palace outside of the city of Paris, like about a 15-minute drive. This is like the treaty that ends World War I. We're going to come back to it when we get to World War II, because Germany really feels like they get the short end of the stick here, and they get kind of screwed by this treaty. And that's something that Hitler's going to use down the road to really whip up, fan the flames in Germany and get the people all riled up. So a couple key things, and I tried to keep it as brief as you could, but I would add all of this in under the Treaty of Versailles in your notes, a little heading, and say like a little side note that this is the treaty that punishes Germany and ends the war. All right. First up, the Allies divide up Austria-Hungary. Remember the other German-speaking like empire that Germany had fought with? That gets divided up into like 9 smaller little countries. So at the end of the war, there is no more Austria-Hungary. There's a country called Austria that's much smaller. There's a country called Hungary. There's a Yugoslavia. There's like the Czech Republic. There's a lot of new countries that are created that are on the map of Europe today, but were not there prior to World War I. Also, the Ottoman Empire gets all busted up. That was the big like Muslim empire that was kind of seated in what is modern day Turkey. That gets broken up into a bunch of smaller countries. Most of it actually goes to the British and French. So like what is modern day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, those are all claimed by the British and French. And like through the war, they started to realize that, hey, this stuff you pump out of the ground, that oil stuff, the black tar, like we can refine that, make it into fuel, and everybody started needing it through the war. Like planes became a thing. More vehicles are being used, tanks. Now the British and French kind of catch on pretty quick that, hey, there's a lot of oil in that spot. Why don't we just add it to our empires, and that'll help us pay for some of the costs of the war. So the Ottoman Empire also all broken up. Now you have Turkey. You have new colonies that are controlled by the British. That's like modern day Iraq, Syria, and a few other places. Russia, even though they were on the Allied side, remember they quit the fighting like right before America got in, and they had a big revolution. And now the Allied powers are looking at Russia like, man, we don't trust them anymore. Now they got rid of their czar, who we kind of trusted, and now they have these communists running the show. And most of the Allied countries at this time did not like or trust the communists one bit at all. So Russia ends up losing territory too, because they didn't see the war through, and they kind of left us hanging, or left the Allied powers hanging. Total 9 new countries are created on the map of Europe. I'll show you the map in just a second. Germany is forced to pay $33 billion in reparations to the Allies, which might not sound like a ton of money today, but $33 billion in like $1919, $1920, that's an awful lot of money. And the German economy is in ruins. So for Germany to have to pay that much after the war was done and they lost and like their economy is just decimated, that was a real like kind of kicking them while they're down. They didn't have the money to pay. Germany is forced to admit total responsibility for the war. Now, if we look at it 100 years later, Germany definitely deserves some blame, without a doubt. But, you listen to my whole story and the assassination and how there were the alliances. I don't think it's fair if we look at it today to say that it was 100% all Germany's fault. I think there was a lot of blame to go around. But according to the treaty, it was 100% Germany's fault. That's something that Hitler is going to use down the road too, because most of the German people, they don't feel like it was all their fault. They feel like, again, they're kind of getting screwed there and getting all the blame for something that, maybe they had a little bit of blame, but man, there was a lot of mistakes made all over in many different countries. The German military is dismantled, so that's a huge blow. Remember, Germany had the best army in the world, basically through most of World War I, but then they had to divide it and fight on 2 fronts. Now there is no more German Navy. The army can only have 100,000 guys, which might kind of sound like a lot, but for a country like Germany that had, in the height of World War I, they had like 7 million guys in uniform. 100,000 is just a drop in the bucket, and the German military is supposed to be like permanently downsized. Now, Hitler's going to ignore all that a few years down the road, but for the meantime, the German army is really hamstrung. They're kind of reduced in size and power, and Germany's not going to be much of a threat for the few years moving forward after World War I. So like overall, kind of an overarching point is that last bullet point I put on here, the humiliation of this, taking all the responsibility, having your military taken away from you, losing, and Germany still exists, but they lose a lot of territory, like about 25% of their territory. All of that is going to lead to a lot of animosity and hard feelings in the German people. And it only took a little bit of time where their economy's really in the dumps and everything, and people are desperate there for a guy like Hitler to eventually, start fanning the flames of that discontent. And then he's able to rise to power. And then eventually another even bigger war breaks out as a result of a lot of it really kind of stems back to this treaty that ends the war. All right, so here is a photo of the main Allied powers. Another thing you could jot in here, and I don't have this on a slide, but it would be kind of a key point. There were 5 Allied powers that attended the Versailles peace conference. All right, you had Great Britain, you had France, you had Italy, America, and Japan. We didn't talk much about Japan, but they had helped out and had been one of the Allied powers since very early on in the war. This photograph at the top shows the leaders of 4 of those powers. You have, this is the tallest guy is President Wilson, our president. This is Clemenceau, who is the French president. This guy, I forget his name, but he's the Italian leader. So my apologies to Italy, but they had not played a really pivotal role in the war. And then this is Lloyd George, who is the British Prime Minister. Notice that the Japanese representative is left out of there. And I guess Japan came out of this conference with a lot of hard feelings, because while they were negotiating and each of those 5 countries had representatives in the room, and then they were kind of lecturing the German representatives across the table, the Japanese guys, of course, there's a language barrier. They don't speak they were speaking French and English at the meeting. No Japanese was spoken. They kind of set the Japanese representatives off in the corner and said, like, thanks for your help. We appreciate everything you did, but you just kind of sit over there and we'll take it all from here. Japan, which is like an honor culture, they feel hugely disrespected. And they're like, man, we fought with these guys and now this is how they're going to treat us. So a kind of a notable thing moving forward, the Japanese feel very offended by the way this all shakes out. And they kind of come to the mindset that, like, you know what? If we can't get any respect from them, from these Allied powers, by fighting with them, well, then maybe we need to fight against them. Maybe that's how we'll earn their respect. And then a kind of a big part for any of you that know anything about World War II, Japan is going to flip sides and be one of the main Axis powers in World War II and fight alongside the Nazis. And a lot of that comes back to how this treaty all played out and how their representatives were treated when they were meeting there. So anyway, here's a painting where, they said they don't, they were negotiating it in this beautiful French palace, and it's almost like metaphorically, they put a gun to the German representatives' heads. They didn't literally do that, but they basically said, you're taking this treaty and you're going to sign it no matter what. And had the German representatives not signed it, they may have literally put a gun to their head and just forced it on them. So Germany feels like it has no say, and that's going to really lead to a lot of discontent. And like they just feel like they got the short end of the stick, and we're really punished for something that wasn't entirely their fault. All right, come back to that a little bit later. Now, my last point where I want to give you a few notes is just like returning home in general. So a couple big takeaways after World War I, some very key things. I would write down everything essentially on this slide. So post-war returning home, one thing that is like ironclad after the end of the war, America is the most powerful country in the world, all right? We made out pretty good. I would say like a World War I is a war where really almost everybody lost. Even the British and French, who came out on the winning end, what did they win? They picked up a couple colonies from the Ottomans. They got a little more territory, got some more oil. But man, they're in horrible debt. Their empires, they're struggling to maintain them. They lost millions of young men. even the winners in World War I were really losers if you look at the big picture. Really, two countries come out looking a little bit better than they were going into it, and it was America, because we joined in very late. We just tipped the tide, and then we come out as like the international banking hub of the world because we had given so much money in loans to the British and French. Now they're very much in debt to us. So America, we do lose some guys, that's tragic and everything, but not as many as any of the other countries. We come out looking stronger than ever, and our Navy is now becoming like the biggest, strongest Navy in the world. We're kind of top dog. Japan comes out pretty good too, even though they felt disrespected at the meeting. Actually, Japan didn't lose many guys, only a few thousand guys. They didn't fight much in the trenches, and they picked up a lot of German colonies that were out in the Pacific. So really, I would add that into your notes on this slide too, that basically World War I is a war where everybody lost on either side of it. Germany and Russia are huge losers. Like, they come out of the war looking way worse than they did going into it. With the exception now, the two countries that actually did come out looking pretty good were America and Japan for different reasons. Another really key point for you that I'd already mentioned, but everybody owes the U.S. money after this war. We were giving out massive loans to specifically the British and French. And before World War I, the international hub of banking was in London, over in England. After World War I, now it's going to be in New York City on Wall Street, where our current stock exchange is. So America kind of becomes like the banking capital of the world throughout World War I. And we are definitely like today, America owes a lot of money. Our deficit has gotten big. That was not the case at the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, everybody owed us money. We had given out loans, and now we're going to start trying to collect on those. So anyway, that's kind of a boom for America, and it's going to lead to the next decade, the Roaring 20s, being a pretty good time in American history. And then the other thing, and this would kind of piggyback into the Lost Battalion. Remember, like Major Whittlesey and those guys in the Lost Battalion you saw, they definitely had PTSD. Major Whittlesey ends up committing suicide over it. He's so depressed, and he was second guessing what he did and waking up with night terrors. Most of these soldiers that had saw combat and were out in the trenches, I think probably from any side, had some form of PTSD and really struggled with it. But boy, we just didn't quite know how to reacclimate them into society. Psychology was a new science. We didn't know what to do with these guys. We wanted to just pat them on the back and thank them and say, well, time to get back to life. But a lot of them just couldn't return to normal after seeing all the horrors of trench warfare. Also, throughout World War I, and Miss Wilkins is going to get into this really soon as we start talking about the suffrage movement, or women trying to get the right to vote. Women had stepped it up big time during the war and had done a lot of replacing men in factories to keep our factories turning out materials. Also, a lot of minorities, a lot of jobs that in the past had been for white men. Well, a lot of the white men get drafted up and sent over to fight in the trenches. So really, women and black men and black women or other minority groups really kind of stepped it up and got into these factory jobs they couldn't have gotten into prior to World War I. Well, kind of a sad thing when the war ends and we want to send all of these soldiers that a lot of them have PTSD. We want to push them right back into their jobs and say, thanks for all your help. Unfortunately, that kicks a lot of the women and minority groups out of those jobs. So kind of a tragedy. There wasn't a really good plan for returning and transitioning back to a peacetime economy. A lot of hard feelings all around, a lot of problems with our soldiers returning, and a lot of problems, we really kind of treated women and minority groups pretty thanklessly because they had sacrificed a lot and really stepped it up during the war. And then they get no appreciation, no thanks when the war is done and we're transitioning back to peacetime. All right, last little thing for you. Here is a map of Europe prior to World War I. So notice in the middle where the biggest changes are going to happen are you have Germany up here, you have Austria-Hungary. Down here, you don't really see much of the Ottoman Empire, what is Turkey, and then here's Russia. Next map isn't a perfect, it's not made by the same company, but this was the best one I could find to show it to you. Now, like all through here was Austria-Hungary. So now you have Yugoslavia, you have Hungary, you have Austria, Czechoslovakia, Romania. These are some new countries that are on the map here. Albania down low. And notice, like now you also have Poland up here where they had taken a lot of land away from Germany and they took land away from Russia, which is now called the Soviet Union or USSR, and created some new countries up top where Russia had lost all this territory too: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So the map of Europe looks much different as the dust kind of settles from this big conflict. All right. Hopefully you got all that stuff. Definitely a lot of exam questions there. So make sure you get all that into your notes. If you got to give it a rewatch, go ahead and do that. And if you have any questions about any of it, by all means, shoot me an email and I'll get you all caught up or give you clarification if you need it. I love yapping about World War I, and I'm kind of heartbroken to see the unit come to a close, but onward in history, and let's start covering some more awesome stuff. See ya.